So when you've got some geometry and you're just beginning to create that geometry in your project, you might use a section that may go on a sheet, and you may have another section that is not going to go on a sheet. So if you have a section that has been placed on a sheet, you'll know that it's of some consequence because it has a drawing number in it. So a lot of times you'll see views in offices that are using Revit where there's a bunch of sections in the plans, and a lot of them don't have page numbers on them. And so, kind of those ones are just there to help build the model, and they're not really part of that. They're nothing that needs to be kept in the long run. So, you can grab these views and just delete them. So, deleting views like sections there's very low impact for that, provided you haven't put any annotations into it. So when we look at the common features of different kinds of views in Revit, whether it's a plan, section, or an elevation, one of the things that's really critical is that each view has a scale. So when you're looking down on the view control bar just below the drawing area, you can see that you've got a toggle here for changing the scale, and the scales that are shown will depend upon whether you are in metric or imperial. If I switch our project right now from metric to imperial, or vice versa, so there's our project units right here. So if I switch to metric now for my length units, I just want you to notice what happens. So previously Revit was showing a list of imperial scales, but now that I switch to metric, now it shows metric scales. Right now it's showing 1 to 96 because that is, of course, what 1/8 of an inch to a foot is when it's converted to a metric scale. So you have your scale, you have your levels of detail. So with your coarse level of detail at large scales, you get a 2-line representation of your construction assemblies. So even here, if I choose a more complicated wall type that's got multiple layers in it, here at the coarse level of detail, it's just 2 lines. Now if I switch to medium, we now begin to see the different layers of materials within our different construction assemblies, within floors, walls, roofs, and ceilings. Now each view that you create in Revit also has a depth. So when you click on a section after you create it, I'm sure you folks can determine what these graphics mean. This of course controls the actual width of the section view, and this controls the depth of the section view. Sections in Revit behave very much like elevations. So really in terms of what they provide to you on the screen, sections and elevations will provide very similar kinds of graphical information.
So where do you grab that box?
So when you're clicking the section line, you'll see this box. And we'll be looking at this soon enough. So each view has its own depth, and even this plan view right now that we are in, I can control how far into the model or how far down into the model that I can see with this plan view. On the flip side, if we're looking at a ceiling plan, we can control how far upwards into the model that we can see with our ceiling plan. So plans, sections, elevations, all of them allow you to control how far into the model they look. Now, every view in Revit of your model has what's called a crop region, if you enable it. So down here on the bottom here on the view control bar, pay attention to these 2 icons right here. This is the crop icon, and then the one next to it is the toggle for whether the crop is shown. So you've got 2 of them here, enabling or disabling the crop and making it visible or hiding it. So if it's turned on and it is enabled, you can click on the crop region and drag it into your view, kind of like resizing a viewport. in AutoCAD. But this crop is in model space. So there's no sort of paper space viewport where you change the crop in Revit. The view is cropped right in the view by enabling the crop region and then making it visible. So here you can see I can adjust how much of the plan is seen. This crop feature will be found in all the different view types: plans, sections, and elevations. So looking at the bottom of page 1 here, now a lot of the features that you see along the bottom here on the view control bar are also found in the properties palette. Now again, what I'd recommend you folks do, very first thing that you do when you come in and you get started with Revit, when you get started with Revit, these two boxes are stacked. Whoops, let's get them stacked here. There we go. Oh, that's not what I want. Anyways, you folks know what I'm getting at here. The project browser and the properties palette are stacked one on top of each other on the left-hand side of your screen. What I suggest that you do is grab the properties palette and drag it over to the right-hand side of your screen. So your cursor, put it on the blue bar of the properties palette, and then drag it sideways until your cursor is over top of the scroll bar on the right-hand side. And by doing that, it will dock your properties palette. There. And the reason that you want to do this every time is so that you get the ability to see as much as possible of the properties palette, and same goes for the project browser. So as I said, a lot of the features that we see on the view control bar are replicated in the properties palette. So things like the scale and the level of detail. So you notice it says coarse here right now. If I go down to the bottom here and switch it to medium, you'll notice that it's changed, of course, in the properties palette as well. Now, we talked about scale and detail level. The third thing to talk about is the display model. That is this one right here. And there's 3 different settings: normal, halftone, or do not display. Now the purpose of this actually has more to do with detailing. What will happen is if you are doing a detail of a certain part of the model, so let's just say here that I want to do a detail. I'm just putting in a window here for a moment. So I want to do a detail at the head of the window. This display model parameter is not often used anywhere except details. So again, we'll talk about this tool in a few minutes, but here's the callout tool. And so let's say I want to do a little detail of the head of this window. If we go and look at what this detail will look like, here's a view of our model, and it's pretty basic. So you can see the window frame here and the jamb and the wall in the background. And even if the wall is, got a few more material layers to it, so there's the brick on the outside and insulation, sheathing, metal studs, and gypsum board. Now, as you go into the detailing process, what ends up happening is that we really end up dispensing with the 3D objects. We've got our width of the wall, we know where the gypsum board is, we know where our frame sits, but this geometry that you see here is pretty basic for the detailing process. So going back to that display model parameter, which is here, what often happens in the detailing process is that we switch this to halftone mode, and you can see what happens in the background. The model appears gray. And then what we'll do is we will add 2D geometry on top, and we will draft this detail much like you did in AutoCAD or whatever CAD program you've been using up till now. So that display model mode is predominantly used in conjunction with the detailing process. Now, one of the features that you may not have paid attention to yet, it's a feature of your plan views. Now, whenever you add a new story in your project, that new view that Revit creates has this underlay setting, and this is it here. So in plan and ceiling plan views, you have this feature where you can see a halftone representation of typically the next story down. So if I were to add a third floor to this project, so here I'm going to go and add another level. This new level that I add, this level 3 plan view, you're going to see it has the underlay of the second story turned on. Now here's those new walls which I just created. Oh, it didn't. Revit's turning me into a liar. All right. I found it quite frequently when I make a new plan view in Revit, it has this underlay turned on, and this is typically what it would do. So I'm on level 3, and it would do an underlay of the second floor. So in gray, those are the walls from the next story down. Now you're not limited to showing those walls from the next story down. You could show them from the next story up. So here, if I draw just a diamond set shaped bit of walls here on the third floor, I can go onto my second floor plan now. Instead of having it underlay level 1, I can ask it to underlay level 3. And now you can see I get that gray representation of my third floor plan. Now with the underlay, you don't have to look down, you can also look up. So let's say that you're in a floor plan and you know that you've modeled a ceiling bulkhead around the perimeter of the room. You can, in any given view, switch your underlay to the same story that you are on right now. But instead of looking down, you can look up. So the advantage of this is that now Revit would show you on your level 2 floor plan the ceiling bulkhead that you had drawn. So maybe you could trace some dashed lines around the edge of that ceiling bulkhead if you wanted to have that bulkhead appear in plan just with some dashed lines. So that way you can turn this underlay, instead of looking down, you can have it look up, and then you can trace some of that stuff into your plan view. Okay, graphic display options. Now there's two ways that you can get at it. The simplified one is down here on the view control bar. And there's all the different basic kinds of displays for the view. So a lot of these you've seen before: wireframe, hidden line, shaded, and so on. So this menu that you see here, and in particular you folks can see this graphic display options at the top. If I were to hit this, it'd be the very same as going into the properties palette, and there's graphic display options right here. So if I hit edit, it brings up this dialog box, which would also appear here. So this also allows you to switch between the different modes: wireframe, hidden, shaded, consistent colors, and realistic, such as we see in this flyout menu before you even get to the graphic display options dialog box. Okay. Title on sheet, bottom of page 1. Now what we're talking about here is what happens when you put a view onto a sheet. So I'm just going to grab this level 1 floor plan, drag it, release it, plunk it on the sheet. So there's my level 1 floor plan. Now, you folks can see that when a view is dragged onto a sheet, the view that you see with the automatically created title matches the view. What if I would like this to say ground floor plan, but still have this view appear as level 1 in the browser. That is in fact what we're talking about here. So in level 1's settings, if we scroll down a little bit here, we will find title on sheet. So what this will do, instead of it being called level 1 on the title block, I can put in here ground floor plan. There we go. And because we put in a new name here, when we go back and look on the title block, it now says ground floor plan. So that allows you to have some independence between the name of the view in the browser and what it says on the title block when the view is placed on a sheet. Okay, we've already talked about the crop view and the crop region visible tools on page 2, the very, very top. Let's talk about annotation cropping. Now, you won't see this. You won't see this in the menu down at the bottom here. The view control bar will not allow you to enable this so-called annotation crop feature. It is in the properties palette only. So here's the 2 checkboxes here that function as the toggles here, so you can see how that's turning crop view on and off, and this is making the crop region visible or not. Now, when you click the crop region, you get a solid boundary that's called the model crop. And if I drag that in, it crops the model. Now, the annotation crop is a dashed crop line, and by the way, neither of these boundaries print by default. By default, Revit does not print your crop regions. You can enable it to do so if you wish. But this dashed crop that you see around the outside, its purpose is to allow annotations like text and dimensions to appear even if they are outside the crop region. So let me give you an example. Here is a dimension I'm going to put in. So if I didn't have the annotation crop enabled, oh come on, that dimension shouldn't appear. Well, I know it would if there's a piece of text. All right. Okay. There. So what the annotation crop does is it allows you to more in a more fine-tuned manner control if annotations appear around the edge of the model. Now, the annotation crop is used in conjunction with dependent views, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, so we will come back to the annotation crop. Now, depth clipping. This is a button, again, that's in the properties box. Here it is here. There's depth clipping. So what this has to do with is when you have objects that are deeper than the view itself. Now, in depth clipping, I should probably talk about view range first. Now, Revit cuts through your model in plan at 4 feet above each story. So here in level 1, Revit is cutting through these walls at 4 feet above the floor line. And that is controlled just below the crop boxes here in the view range dialog box. Now, what we'll do here is I'm going to get you folks to open a file in the Session 3 Share Out folder. So if you folks want to go to this file, it's in BLDG 2800 Session 3, and it's called the Revit View Range Tutorial. So there it is there, Revit View Range Tutorial. Just so you know what you're looking at here, this is the building here, so it's kind of a wedge-shaped building with a simply sloped roof. And then it's got some interconnected floor space between the 3 different stories of this building. So I'm in the 3D view, so if you go to the View tab and hit the 3D view, like the little doghouse icon, remember, hold down your Shift key and then your wheel on your mouse, and that allows you to orbit the model. So, what we're going to be talking about here is the view range of the 3rd floor. So just go up to the top right corner of the 3D view and close it, and go back to the 3rd floor plan. Now, this is where the literal cutting aspect of a Revit floor plan becomes quite readily seen. Have a look at this roof. It's getting cut at 4 feet above the floor line. So what we're going to do is introduce the features of plan and ceiling plan views that deals with all of these issues. Now you're going to see a section that cuts right through the building where you see the blue section head. Double click on it, and that's going to take you to this view here, where this section is meant to discuss how the 3rd floor plan works and its settings. So each plan and reflected ceiling plan has 4 settings. The top setting, cut, bottom, and view depth. Now the most important setting of all of those is the cut plane, because that is really where the building is seen as far as Revit is concerned. So there's a red line here, 4 feet above the floor. You can see where it comes over and hits the roof. So just think of this being sliced horizontally, and this big wide band that you see here is the roof being cut through in plan. So if I go back and double click on the level 3 floor plan, that explains this kind of little zone here that we see. It's the roof being cut through. I remember when I was first implementing Revit years ago and dealing with some architects who'd been in industry even before the advent of CAD. And they found this whole thing annoying, that the roof was actually being cut through in plan. The younger architects who are fresh out of school, they like the sort of fresh and literal aspect of plans. But if you'd been practicing architecture for a while, the literalness of a Revit plan is makes them sad, I guess, because it's not sort of symbolic in nature. But regardless, it's something that you need to know as you are using Revit. Now in the plan view, go find the view range button and click it. So here are the 4 different settings, and you can see them in the notes. Top, cut, bottom, view depth. Those 4. Now by default, when a new plan or ceiling plan is created, the bottom and the view depth have the same setting. Usually the story that you are on, the level that you are on. So when the level 3 floor plan was first created, the bottom and the view depth were both set to level 3 with the value of 0. In this case, we've modified the level 3 floor plan and changed its view depth to level 2. This is just to illustrate the difference between the bottom and the view depth. So I'm going to go back to the section now. We're going to talk about this in more detail. So the zone between the top and bottom of a view is called the primary view range. In this zone, you can window select objects. Now, if you take the view depth and you make it farther down, than the bottom. Extra objects will appear if they fall into this zone. So here on level 2, we've got some furniture that appears in the level 3 plan now because the view depth was set to level 2. Now, this is not within the primary view range. So what's the big deal? Well, these desks that you see here that are orange, it's the same thing as this desk here. So I can window select this furniture on the level 3 floor plan, but watch what happens when I try to window select them on the second floor. I can't. I can click on them and select them. So you can see I can click on them, but I cannot window select them. So objects that still appear in the view because of the view depth setting, if they're lower than the bottom, you cannot window select them, but you can click them. So I can select them, just not window select. Now you folks will notice that they appear orange. So in any plan view, if you have the view depth lower than the bottom and objects appear as a result of that, these objects are given a special line type, and it's called Beyond. And we would find this in Manage, Additional Settings, Line Styles. So this is a special line type given to those objects that are below the bottom of the view range, but still within view depth. So once you get into this Line Styles dialog box, you got to expand it. And Beyond is right at the top of the list. Now out of the box, Revit has this Beyond line style as black. Okay, that's great. What in Revit on our screens is black? Everything. So if you're trying to find some way of differentiating something that's on a different story versus something that's on the current story, well, making it black is not going to help. That's why I made it orange. And in the notes, I suggest you make it gray. This will make it very clear that these desks are on a different story than the one that you're on right now. So from that perspective, I would highly recommend that you take your Beyond line style and turn it into a gray color, as I have done here. Now let's go back to the depth clipping feature. So in our plan view here, let's go and find a depth clipping button. So if you have an object that keeps on going down, 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 down into your model beyond the end of your primary view range, this is asking you, how do you want those objects displayed? Now, many years ago, like 2005 or 2007 or something like that, Henry and I were working on a project at the office where he was working. I was working for Autodesk at the time, and it was on the twisting tower. I guess it's called the Trump Tower here in Vancouver. And you guys know the one. It was one of Arthur Erickson's last projects, and it had kind of a lozenge-shaped triangular floor plate. And Henry, was it 2.5 degrees per story? How much did it rotate? 2.5 or 5? 2.5. 2.5. So every story as it went up, this whole thing just kind of twisted 2.5 degrees. I'm kind of exaggerating it here. So this thing spun as it went up. On the outside, there was a structural column that was on the outside of the slab that went down 5 stories and wrapped its way down around the building. Now, the problem that Henry's having was that these columns, because it was a single object, when you looked at any given floor plan, you got this. You got these weird little sticks sticking out of the floor plan where these columns were placed. And this is because Revit did not have this feature that we're talking about right now. If Henry's able to work with Revit 2018 right now, he could just say either clip with line or clip without line. So back in the old days, this is the only feature Revit could do, no clip. So those crazy columns were sticking out from the edges of the plan and it looked really weird. So instead we could say maybe clip without line, And what would happen is that this column would just kind of look like it's just got cut off. Right? Or you could say clip width line, and then it would just kind of put that little line there where it exits the depth of the view. So that's what this is about. So typically, I will either use the no clip feature or clip without line, just so it's clear to the person that this object does continue out of the view. Okay, I think what we'll do is we will take a 10-minute break for coffee, and then we will come back.